Thanks, Courtney. Hopefully this will be a good segue. I was actually part of the English Learner sort of broad report that included two studies. One of them was done by Ilana Umansky at the University of Oregon, and she was focusing more broadly on sort of the situation of English learners in the state of California. And then the second report was co-authored with Christine Snyder, who's a graduate student here at Claremont Graduate University. So let me just backtrack for a second and talk just very briefly overall about English learners, since one of the reports and a large part of that research brief deals with ELs. As all of you know, English learners are one of California's most vulnerable populations, student populations. And we can see that by their outcomes. Far fewer English learners meet state standards in language arts and mathematics, and graduation rates are about 10 percentage points lower. So they're a vulnerable population, and they're a population that policymakers, scholars, and just everyone is generally very concerned about. It's a big population in California. Close to 40% of students enter California's public schools as an English learner. The vast majority exit that designation at some point in elementary school, but there's a subset that actually remains classified English learner for far longer. And I say that they're vulnerable, but it's important to consider why they are so vulnerable. So part of it is sort of a vulnerability that comes from their background. Most English learners are low income, low socioeconomic status, and their parents have low levels of education. So they're made vulnerable by their background. But they are also made vulnerable, ironically, by policies that were initially designed to help them. So oftentimes they sort of fall they suffer through those policies. And the three things that I want to point out, the three main policies that are having what we could think of as maybe unintended consequences on ELs are reclassification policies, access to core content, which Susanna mentioned earlier on in the introduction, and then teacher preparation, which is going to continue some of what Courtney was talking about, and also what Desiree was talking about a bit before. So let me talk about reclassification first. I don't actually have a bullet on this slide about reclassification, but reclassification has been found by the research to be quite problematic in California. Now, as many of you know, the system is in flux, and it is moving towards a more uniform way of redesignating kids out of EL status. But up until very recently, each district could set their own criteria for reclassifying English learners. And what this ended up causing, as several researchers have found, including Ilana Umansky in her own research that was done for this study, was that it becomes kind of a double burden for ELs, because they have to pass the language proficiency benchmarks, and they also have to pass the content benchmarks. And it is one of the only populations for which these standards are very, very high stakes. Because you could have a situation where a kid passes the language test and does not pass the ELA standards test, and they will remain reclassified. And so one of the notes in Ilana's paper is about considering the removal of this academic criteria. The second policy that makes ELs sometimes vulnerable is access to core content. So even though this has been an issue for many, many years, we are still finding that English learners are severely limited in their access to core academic content, particularly in middle school and high school. They tend to take fewer academic courses. They tend to take fewer courses that will lead to credits towards college. This is a key issue because it becomes sort of a tracked system, and some ELs realize, and their parents realize too late, that they're on this quote unquote inferior academic track. And then the final policy that sometimes, or we have seen that works sort of not necessarily in favor of English learners, has to do with teacher preparation. So with all the caveats that Courtney just mentioned in terms of data, we did actually a document review of California's preliminary and induction requirements, expectations, and standards. And we did a small qualitative study of teachers, new teachers going through induction in the classroom. And what we found in our study was that at the preliminary level, the system overall lacks key assurances that teachers have the skills and dispositions that we know from the literature are essential for equitable, inclusive teaching of English learners in the classroom. A lot of these things are embedded in preliminary programs and teachers learn them at some point, but they happen in situations that are not very representative of what teachers encounter once they enter the classroom. For example, at various points in teacher preparation, teachers have to show evidence of being able to plan a lesson for an English learner. It is very seldom the case, particularly in Southern California and other places of LA, that teachers will just teach one English learner. Oftentimes they have multiple English learners in their classroom of multiple proficiencies and abilities, and they have to tailor instruction to that, which is a very complicated thing, and teachers feel very unprepared to do that. Also, induction is a very flexible, personalized process. So if teachers do not elect to make ELs a focus of induction, it will not be an emphasis. And so it becomes kind of a missed opportunities for teachers to develop their skills. That's broadly what we found and the three things that I wanted to highlight today.